So, imagine this for a moment, if you will. We're here. It's 2025. Deltarune chapters 3 and 4 have come out with a bang. We're living the dream. Many smiles, many tears, many answers, much more questions. You know how it is. Let's see, we got the roaring night, the egg rooms, the holidays, the shadow crystals versus juicy. You get the picture. There's a lot of lore, mysteries, and otherwise gamer pinata candy to go around for all of us to scurry around scooping up like it's Tony's birthday and bust the little white dog-shaped pinata open for all of us to enjoy. Not to mention the music, God bless. Hobie's music theory game's on another level, holy smokes. Are you hearing this? Oh yeah, things are going great. We're having a blast. But then, all of a sudden... If I know there's one thing that's captivated the masses, both in-universe and out, it's this prophecy, after we probably collectively forgot about it since Chapter 1. It's a little wild to have only gotten a glimpse of it, or a summary of it, back in Chapter 1, to now then realize that, wait, it's kind of like a pretty important part of the world here. Like, the prophecy of Deltarune, not to be confused with its religious iconography, the Deltarune, has a religion built around it and everything, in the light world even. And might be what the literal world of this place is called too? Maybe. You know, I don't really think it struck me how prophecies in fantasy worlds could become religious convictions for the people living in them before. But that's for another time. So, the prophecy. Comedically specific in some parts, subtly vague in others to be interpreted differently where it needs to be. Some parts apparently lost to time and darkness and sky or whatever. But most importantly, most worryingly, accurate. As Rousey says, everything in the prophecy either has come to pass or will come to pass, no matter what. Which is a shame because the ending isn't a happy one. Just earlier in the same chapter as when we discover this, chapter 4, Rousey himself was crying, begging Susie not to look ahead and read what the last prophecy had to say, all but having a breakdown when he thought Susie had already seen it. When we do see it for ourselves, it describes a final tragedy. It's pretty clear something bad's gonna go down. But what is it exactly? Now, if you've played the game and been following the theories and discussion around this game post chapters 3 and 4, you've probably seen a lot of talk about this last prophecy among other things. Which, fair enough, as it is one of the biggest questions the game leaves off on by the time we hit the credits and wait for the next chapter. The story's ending? Why was Rousey so scared that Susie would see it? What about it was so bad Susie punched the glass to break it even though she'd get her fist all cut up? What exactly is this ending we're trying to avoid? And what kind of ending are we hoping to build ourselves with the Fun Gang's efforts? Okay, this is the part where I gotta admit, I haven't been keeping up with the theories and discussion much at all. I've heard some theories here and there, but I don't really have a good thumb on the scale as for what exactly is popularly agreed on in the fandom. Or what's, popularly agreed on. So, all that to say, I have a theory on what exactly the missing piece of the last prophecy we didn't get to see might be, but I don't exactly know how it'll go over with most people who might have already developed their own thoughts and assumptions about how it might go. This isn't me coming from any standpoint in the theorizing community already or whatever. This is just sort of raw and from the heart, trying to communicate what I have to say as clearly as I can. I'll try and go over a few of the other thoughts I've heard around through osmosis about what the last prophecy might be, and what sort of natural conclusions we can come to just by looking at it from a narrative standpoint, and then I'll get into the meat of what I came up with. First of all, just to get it out of the way, we can deliberate on this to the end of the world and back forever and ever and ever about what the last prophecy is and what it might mean, but, with the information we have, there really is no way to know what it actually said. I have my thoughts on it, you have your thoughts on it, But until Tricky Tony swings at us with the next 3 chapters of Deltarune and kills us in one shot with the answer somewhere in there, there is no way to know. There is no definitive answer we can ever pin down with the information we have, for all the big talk we give. There's literally just not enough information to spell out the answer. It's something that will be answered, but won't be here at the halfway point. To be clear, this applies to the theory that I'm going to tell you about that I have too. This is just what I think is going to happen, from a reader's point of view, doing some analysis on the characters as best as I can. I think it could be true, and might be likely that it's true, but I'm not about to tell you to your face that I know it's true. I want to have more faith in your critical thinking skills than that. Now to the theories themselves. Let's look at the evidence we do have to go off of. Rouse has been looking around for something in the Sanctuary Dark World throughout the whole entirety of Chapter 4, even sneaking off when he's got a moment to. And when Susie mentions almost seeing what the last prophecy had to say, he gets really panicked and scared and begs her not to run off ahead that she might read it, and to let him go first instead. Presumably he's been hunting for windows that reveal the last prophecy, probably to scope it out and see if things have changed, and if they haven't, to then shatter the windows before his friends see. Well, they slip up and forget to keep track of this in the excitement after the Titan battle, and Susie ends up seeing it after all, and, in reaction, breaks the windows with her bare fist, even leaving it bleeding after getting cut up by the glass. She calls the prophecy stupid after spending just about the whole chapter leading up to this being amazed and thinking highly of it for how cool and accurate the prophecy has been up to now, and is putting a lot of effort into not seeming to take it seriously. Pretty big turnaround there. Important quote in particular to take note of from Susie is her saying, "I wouldn't let it happen, Chris wouldn't let it happen, and obviously you wouldn't let it happen." Rousey's response to this. Oh boy. He's clearly really thankful for Susie's response among other things, but he's also crushed that supposedly, whatever thing in the prophecy we didn't get to see didn't change due to the adventures they'd had so far, and that their fate is already decided. He breaks down before quickly trying to put up his smiling happy front again, and is shown compassion, or not, by Chris, and so on. I don't mean to always make it about me. What an odd thing to say. Literary analysis not being the Deltarune fandom's strong suit aside, the preceding inferences one can make based on this evidence goes as follows. There's only one way that the world can be saved in the end, and it seems to follow that all 3 of the Fun Gang would at the very least be heavily involved in its happening, given that Susie believes that all 3 of them could keep it from happening, especially Rousey. And quite importantly, whatever it is, it's bad. Bad enough to send Rousey into a breakdown when Susie comes close to finding out, and bad enough to shake, if not break, Susie's faith in the prophecy entirely when she does find out. Not to mention, it's even explicitly labeled a tragedy in the text of the prophecy itself. Not what we were looking forward to. The sort of ideas I've heard circulated around about the last prophecy and predicting what the tragedy will be usually fall into one of 2 camps. Either it's about sealing up the dark worlds forever and ensuring no dark fountains could be opened up ever again, or it's about one or more of the Fun Gang dying. And this isn't any shade for me, my theory technically falls into one of these categories too. They're good instincts to have, with Susie having the strongest reaction to the tragedy of the last prophecy, and the importance that she places on her friends that we see in Chapter 3 stemming from her troubles making and keeping friends in the past. Both of these outcomes would be pretty damn crushing to her especially. Her friends dying would fucking suck, for one, obviously, and closing up the Dark Worlds forever would mean sealing away one of the avenues that she's made the most amount of real friends she's ever had through. So how do we parse all this? And how do we think about it in a way that's conducive to considering what, in fact, that little window of the prophecy might have said? When it comes to theories and whether or not I find them believable, I find it useful to condense the surrounding contexts to one or more key questions that the theories should be able to give a reasonable or satisfying answer to. Here's the key questions I think of in terms of guessing what the last prophecy has to say. Why is Rousey so scared of Susie seeing the end of the story? Why does Susie react like that when she does see it? Why does Rousey react the way he does when Susie dismisses it? Now that we have a framework to work off of, we can dig a little deeper into some of the more specific ideas I've seen around as to what it could be, and how believable or not I personally find them. I don't really think it was about closing up the Dark Worlds forever, because I don't think it quite matches with Susie's reaction here, breaking the glass and calling it stupid. Her own relationship with being around the Dark Worlds themselves has been near entirely positive up to this point, but she isn't naive, especially up to the end of Chapter 3 onward. She knows that the Dark Worlds are hard to explain, dangerous safe zones for the Roaring Knight to do whatever they want in, and can quite easily be used to kidnap people without a trace. She even saw one such kidnapping herself. Her biggest reason for wanting to keep the Dark Rounds around is very much the friends she was able to make through them, even more so than the adventures she gets to go on with Chris and Rousey within them. Susie has been growing more and more heroic as the story has been going along, and I think if it came down to it, if there really was only one way to save the worlds, and that would mean sealing the Dark Worlds forever, I think she'd be willing, or at the very least, wouldn't stop it, as long as she got to keep as many friends as she could from it. And as we've seen in Chris, Noelle, and Toriel, she has been able to keep her friends in the Light World. The Dark World gave her hope that she could make and keep friends, and that's carried out into the Light World. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think if the prophecy were about closing up the Dark Worlds forever, a more realistic reaction would be Susie putting it together that closing up the Dark Worlds forever would mean never seeing their Darkmoor friends ever again, and Rousey trying to reassure her that she wouldn't be losing her friends in the Light World, so she wouldn't be alone. But Susie wouldn't be seeing her whole world falling apart here. She knows she's made friends in Chris and Noelle and even Toriel, and while the Dark World gave her the hope that she'd be able to keep them as friends in the first place, she knows that being in the Light World didn't magically make their friendship disappear. What Susie would be seeing here in this case is her Darkner friend facing a tragic fate where he's going to disappear along with the rest of the Dark World, and trying to reassure her that it'll be okay. And of course, Susie's not going to take that lying down. She might even make the assertion then and there that she's going to break the rules and find some way to bring Rousey, Lancer, and all the rest of their Darkner friends to the Light World, just so that no one's getting left behind. Okay, hypothetical ends there. It's important to note, though, that the whole idea that Susie and Chris would eventually have to leave all the Darkner friends behind, because the Dark Worlds would all have to be closed up forever, is almost the exact same theming that permeated the narrative of Chapter 3, which could lend credence to the closing Dark Worlds theory as for what the last prophecy is, as it'd be a recurring theme, but I don't think it quite fits. Let's look at our key questions, starting with number 1. Why would Rousey be so deathly afraid of Susie seeing the prophecy? If he already knows the Dark Worlds are all going to disappear at the end of the story, and he shouldn't get too attached to existing and being friends with Chris and Susie, then the only reason I can point to as to why he's been so terrified to let Susie read ahead would be because he's afraid of disappointing her or taking away her hope. Susie made the assertion back in Chapter 3 that no one would be left behind, Darkner or not, and Rousey would be afraid to let her see the last prophecy because it'd run completely counter to what Susie wants to happen. Now, with that in perspective, why would Rousey be afraid of that? He knows that Susie already breaks the rules in so many ways. It's in her DNA as a character. I just can't see why Rousey would think Susie would react any other way aside from reassuring him that they'll all just find some way to break the rules again and make sure that the Darkners will get out of it safe and sound, Dark World or not. And now let's discuss the other possibility, that one or more of the Fun Gang will have to die at the end. We'll take it slow, doing one at a time, because it'll be a lot to swallow, and I want you to save room for my theory afterwards. I've seen a lot of people say once they get to the line of thought that someone will die in the last prophecy, that it'll be Rousey, like as a sort of literal sacrificial lamb or goat, I feel like it's the one I see most often, but I don't think that's right. Let's look at the elephant in the room first. This little goober's way too self-sacrificing to feel like him needing to die at the end of the story to save the world would be a bad thing. A more realistic way this scene would have played out would have been Rousey trying to reassure and convince Susie that it's just what has to happen, even though they've basically already had this conversation back at the end of chapter 3. So he knows convincing her would be a futile effort. It does fit Susie's reaction a little better, as this would be specifically targeting one of her best friends in a really unfair way, and would warrant a more violent reaction, answering the second key question, but I don't think it solves the first. If Rousey needing to accept that Susie and Chris won't be throwing him away or leaving him behind is something introduced in Chapter 3 and going to be a recurring theme through the rest of future chapters onward, I think he needs more time than solely right there at that point in Chapter 4 in order to really internalize that truth. Rousey's fear of Susie seeing the prophecy far more fits the concept that it's about Susie dying herself. But as a sort of ironic inverse to that, I don't think her reaction really fits as a response to that instead. I think Susie seeing that she was literally destined to die at the end of the adventure in order to save the world would take it pretty rough at first, as something directly targeting that hope growing within her. She'd see it as herself singled out yet again, not only out of her friends, but by another system that she'd placed hope and trust in before getting dashed, reaffirming her place in the world as the outcast and the one left behind, as the one no one wanted, as the dragon to be slain, as the bad guy. I don't think it'd be enough to dash her hopes outright, but I do think that a more realistic reaction would go something like Susie getting really quiet for a minute there, with maybe some pointed words towards Rousey when he approaches, sort of mirroring the confrontation earlier in the chapter, questioning why he wanted to keep this from her, before actively deciding for herself that she's going to hold on to her hard-won hope, keep going and keep living despite what the prophecy says, defying it. The biggest key difference I think would be here is that Susie would be taking the prophecy much more seriously, because it's in line with the worldview she had believed to be true for a very long time already. In this case, she's being told something she expected, not from the prophecy before now, but from nearly every other adult figure and system she'd met in her life. Notably, a response that does not happen when she looks at it in canon. Susie isn't stupid. She'd know that if the prophecy really had chops and was speaking in line with what she's been told she is over and over again, and what she'd believed for so long, then it'd be something to recognize as part of the greater collective to understand and actively work against. But Susie outright doesn't believe it. What the prophecy was saying wasn't something familiar or words that struck a chord inside her somewhere. It was so absurd to her that she just didn't believe it. Really, what was up with that? As a side note, I gather some people might take this complete refutation of the prophecy from Susie to mean that it is solely her that might die, given the guidance she's been receiving from a particular turtle over the course of the chapter. It is true that Gerson has been dropping hints and nudging Susie in that sort of direction, that she might be better off writing her own story instead of just following the prophecy, and all that comes to a head when fighting the Hammer of Justice. But keep in mind, this is a personal development completely optional to the story. The Hammer of Justice is a secret boss, after all. Gerson's teaching can certainly prime Susie to be more resistant to submitting to the fate the prophecy may lay out for her. But what must be considered is that she has this reaction regardless of whether Gerson has the chance to, as this outcome of the chapter doesn't change whether the secret boss fight is completed or not. And as we've seen in both her backstory from Chapter 3 and in the Weird Root in Chapter 4, Susie is susceptible to the torments of being excluded, treated as worthless and unwanted, being separated from the connections she's wanted to make all this time. So being told that she would be the necessary expense, the unavoidable price to pay in order to save the world, I don't think that's something she can just turn around her whole opinion on the prophecy into not believing it just like that. Especially not after seeing it be completely true and accurate all this time. What that panel had to say has to be shocking, rage-inducing, something she outright can't believe. not something she already has believed for a while. Before we move on, as for Chris being the only one to die, well, let me put it this way. I think that you could make arguments that Rousey's fears are justified if it's Chris that's fated to die, or that Susie's disbelief and violent reaction makes sense if she just saw that it's Chris that won't make it to the end. Or even that Rousey's reaction to Susie's words makes sense in a sense that he's sort of speaking on Chris's behalf. There are reasonable arguments there in terms of the key questions we'd come up with earlier. However, I just don't think that it can only be Chris in a logistical sense, for one reason at the minimum. Susie. Susie and Chris are a pair at this point in the story, now that they're real friends and on each other's wavelengths. Other characters associate them with each other, they associate themselves with each other, and the gameplay itself even affirms this too. Unless something bad or weird is happening, the default state of the game itself from post-Chapter 2 onward considers itself to be thus. If Chris isn't alone, they're with Susie. You know what I think Susie's reaction to Chris having to die or face the darkness alone or whatever at the end of the last prophecy would be? Bet! And she goes with him anyways. If Susie's character is leading up to anything, there isn't a chance that she'll leave Chris alone in their hour of need, and especially not after seeing the writing on the wall. If the prophecy is telling her that Chris alone is going to die at the end of the story, there's no way she isn't doing something about it. And maybe Rousey knows this, and his logic to not wanting Susie to see it is that he doesn't want her to have to die too when she doesn't need to. Maybe Susie knows this too, and is why she's playing off what she saw in the prophecy as so wholly unbelievable. Maybe Rousey speaking about how kind Susie is and how infectious her hope is more speaking towards Chris's own sentiments on the matter, since Rousey technically wouldn't be directly involved himself in the prophecy where it ends in Chris's death or sacrifice alone. I do think there's grounds here, and I'm not here to dispute that. But in that case, well, I guess if both Susie and Rousey know that Susie wouldn't let this lie, then why wouldn't the prophecy know too and just account for that and what it has to foretell? Just feels like the prophecy, to me, would probably want to account for the unstoppable force that is Susie if it wants to go off without a hitch. That's sort of taking a point away from my believing that it'd be only Chris on the chopping block there. Unless the heroes described in the prophecy aren't supposed to have been the fun gang in the first place, but that's for another time. So that's all three heroes covered individually. As for combinations of heroes foretold to meet their end, I think really any combination of 2 or 3 of them would check out pretty well with what we know. All 3 of them care for each other deeply and have each other's backs, and Susie especially isn't going to leave one of her friends out to dry if they were in mortal danger at whatever the end playing out in-game might look like. Even if Susie were the only one foretold to be spared by the last prophecy instead, she'd still have a pretty reasonable case for acting the way she does, too. It's not only one best friend, but both her best friends supposed to die from this and leave her alone. And that'd be a pretty cruel twist of irony after the development and hope she's grown since starting all these adventures. However, in my own theory, I do feel like there's a pair of 2 of them in particular that works best with what we've seen so far, better than the other possible combinations. Right, I should probably get to that, shouldn't I? So, we have our evidence and we have our questions. In short, it's something that all 3 of the Fun Gang will have a hand in, with a connection to Rousey emphasized in particular. It's something Susie outright doesn't believe or finds so absurd that she can just laugh it off. And it's something Rousey was terrified of the others finding out about, on top of his whole reaction to Susie's kindness after discovering it herself. Again, it's not a lot to go off of. We don't have anything concrete other than what we see in the text, and that's on purpose. It'd fucking suck if we just got told the supposed ending here and now when there's only 4 chapters out, and genuinely much better to not only keep an engaged audience, but better serves the story itself. How much are we being shown about the characters from what we are expressly prevented from seeing with our own eyes? How much are we being shown about their relationships, their values, what they hold to be true? We can speculate endlessly on whatever the fresh fuck tragic horrors Susie saw on this pane of glass, and the story is all the better for it. That said, we live in a world where the natural next step in the story we're told is that some tragic fate, some mortal danger befalls one or more of our heroes as the only way to save the worlds they live in. That is, a number of heroes between 1, 2, and 3. One dies, and the other two are left to mourn their lost friend together. 3 die, and they all take hands and embrace the darkness forever. 2 die, and the single hero spared by fate is left behind to mourn their best friends, cast alone by the prophecy's unrelenting hand. But what if? What if it became even darker? What if we took the one tragically left alone and made their role in the prophecy and the path to get there far, far worse? Rousey, oh Rousey, the poor lonely prince. What if not only did he have to watch his 2 best friends die at the end of the prophecy, but he had to figuratively wield the knife to sacrifice them himself, too. Let's come back to our key questions and discuss how this concept would fit into what we know from the game as we see it now. Why is Rousey so deathly afraid of Chris and Susie seeing the last prophecy? This one is answered pretty easily. There's the reasoning of him being worried that Susie will take it badly or act rashly upon finding it out. It's true. But there'd be another angle at play here. Think of how the prophecy would be implicating Rousey in Chris and Susie's eyes. No matter his own feelings on the matter, or his own hopes that he wouldn't have to if they played their cards right. He'd been looking for the last prophecy throughout the entirety of the Sanctuary Dark Worlds just to verify if it had changed or not, and upon seeing that Susie was close to seeing it before getting to check it himself, of course he'd be terrified. He'd be thinking he's about to lose a friend, perhaps one or both of the only real friends he's ever had. Why would they want to hang out with and still be friends with the one who's literally fated to kill them, in the prophecy that's always been right before, and likely will always be right onwards? All 3 of the Fun Gang are really close and personally attached to the other 2, and Rousey is no exception to this. Of course keeping his friends would be a pretty high priority in his book, just as it would be for Susie and Chris. Why does Susie act so disbelievingly when she sees it? This one's pretty easy too, in case you could tell. She's coming up to this prophecy and getting told that her best friend is going to have to sacrifice her and her other best friend at the end of the story to save the world? Get a grip, man! Not only would it be absolutely absurd that it'd be Rousey of all people that'd apparently be supposed to kill her and Chris, but I think she'd know too, with how terrified Rousey's been acting up to this point, that this would be the reaction he'd need to hear too. So even if there were any doubts or concerns that Rousey might seem like he'd actually go through with it, there wouldn't be a chance that she'd share any of them anyhow. What's up with Rousey's reaction after Susie comforts him and leaves with complete faith that the last prophecy was totally bogus? This question we didn't really get into for the other potential possibilities for what the last prophecy could have been, aside from a few details that support them. Mostly because we didn't really need to. But we can really get into this question for the theory here, because it's my video and I want to. Susie, she's a really, really nice person, Chris. How can she be so kind? How? I'm sorry, Chris. I'm sorry I didn't say the whole prophecy at first. I thought if I said something different, if we did something different, if we were just kind enough, perhaps by the time we got here, it would change. But no matter what we do, our fate is already decided. Sorry, don't look at me. I don't mean to always make everything about me. So let's take a step back. Once again, we're looking at a prophecy with a tragic ending that all 3 of the Fun Gang are involved in somehow, seeming to emphasize Rousey's hand in it more than the others. something that he's afraid of the others finding out about, but something also weighing on himself with how afraid he is of it, too. The more he goes on and the better friends he becomes with Chris and Susie. And when Susie comforts him, tells him that everything's gonna be alright, Rouse is just shocked. Shocked at how kind she is to be comforting him in the face of what she just saw. What kind of fate is waiting for them for Rouse to be so shocked about this specifically? Well, maybe. Maybe one that spells out a fate that ends much, much worse for his friends than it'll end for him. I don't mean to always make everything about me. On the one hand, poor guy. And I recognize this kind of talk from other real life friends of mine that had low self esteem when we were teens, and I'm so sorry, dude. But on the other hand, it sure is one hell of a thing to say to the face of someone he's fated to kill. And I think Chris knows that too. Something that was pointed out to me by Tumblr user Alice Lufenia was that Chris doesn't only have the option to show Rouse comfort here. The option to say, good, keep smiling, being one that Chris answers with her full chest is telling. Especially when they've been expressing more control on other despairing dialogue options earlier on in the chapter. There's a reason why it's an option to say at all. Chris would be expressing that frustration, that bitterness, that Rouse was in fact making it about himself, when it's not like it was him the prophecy says would be dying at the end. After what must have been a long time of feeling detached and depersoned, Chris has gotten to become close with some of the greatest friends they've likely ever gotten to know, and is finally coming back to feeling like a person, like themselves again. And faced with the discovery, or reminder, that they wouldn't be living to see the end of it, juxtaposed with their friend having a breakdown over his own much, much more charitable role in terms of what the future has in store for him. Well, in this brief slip in composure, Chris still embraces the option to set it aside in order to comfort their friend. But that emotion, that bitterness is still there, and it's one they feel strongly enough to not bite it back if pushed to express it. Okay, so again, let me say it again. We don't have any concrete evidence to go off of, and that's expressly on purpose. All we have for this question in particular is speculation based off the Fun Gang's reaction and vibes, unfortunately. So any theory that anyone might come up with about this whole last prophecy thing will always be steeped in this caveat that all it can really amount to is speculation, and how edgy the theory maker might have been feeling when waking up that morning. Yeah, I get it. I know what you might be thinking. Come on, Chris and Susie dying is one thing, but what's up with all this sacrifice business? That's a bit much, isn't it? But then again, it's not like it's coming out of nowhere either. Who was phone when calling Chris back at the holiday house mentioned a police sacrifice next week. So I don't think it's a bit of a stretch that needing to sacrifice someone or multiple someones to the dark or whatever would be important for something related to the prophecy, or even just future events of the game we've yet to see. Because it's mentioned at all in the first place, it has to have a function of some kind. And if Carol or the Knight or whatever might need to sacrifice someone for one purpose, the Fun Gang might need to make a similar sacrifice to counteract that purpose. Who knows? It's fun to think about and speculate, at least. Well, fun. Another quick addendum about this I'd like to bring up as well, the sword route. Not only do you have specific descriptions of people being used up for the purposes of furthering a specific goal, in the same way items might be in the second act of the sword route, but in the third act, your literal only means of progressing is to sacrifice two of your other party members in order to, say it with me, become stronger. I have to wonder if this might follow as another difference between the main route and the weird route. Perhaps on the weird route, our pursuit of power and becoming stronger will ensure that Chris will be the one that sacrifices the other two heroes in the prophecy, rather than Rouse. And that being one reason that Rouse questions whether the alternate ending they're looking for won't be even worse. Because remember, hero_sword doesn't exactly fare well in the sword route either. They get thanked and used up all the same. Well, they come back, of course, being a different level of only a video game. And we can speculate on how diegetic the sword route might end up being all we want until the cows come home. But it does raise the question. All that heartbreak of the weird route, all that betrayal and suffering, that sacrifice, with a chance that not even a single one of the three heroes will get to see the fruits of it all for what? A different ending? I'd like to take a moment to point out other moments that could act as symbolic parallels to the idea that Rousey might have to sacrifice Chris and Susie at the end of the last prophecy. Not as primary evidence towards it, but rather secondary evidence in that it'd better support the claim after the fact as narrative parallels and foreshadowing elements leading up to when it'd actually happen. Rousey leaving Chris and Susie alone for nearly the entirety of the second sanctuary, a place of overwhelming darkness where the Lightners had to face off against someone they believed to be a friend. Susie and Chris leaping into the Titan, into the dark, at the end of the chapter boss fight and leaving Rousey behind. Rousey saying our fate is already decided while literally stained with his friend's blood. Like, you see what I'm saying, right? The symbolism this could be for alluding to the whole last prophecy ordeal is driving me crazy. It just adds on to how it fits really well with the thematic elements to the narrative we have thus far. Oh, themes. Right. Now, I know we're only halfway through the story of Deltarune at this point, and it might seem a bit like jumping the gun to be talking about overarching themes across the game's broader structure when half of it isn't even out yet, but hang on. We do have at least one pretty compelling recurring theme we've seen so far, and one that's been growing and developing pretty consistently throughout the chapters so far as they've come out. The theme in question being as follows. It's horrifyingly, paralyzingly easy to hurt others and deal lasting damage you can't ever really undo, and even easier to do so to those you love, no matter how much you like and care for and want the best for each other. In fact, this is even an inevitability to sharing your love with someone, an inescapable bump in the road in the journey of your relationship with them that'll happen 1,000 times over as long as you know each other, whether it's happened in the past or not, and will happen again and again in the future. But we don't stop, even upon acknowledging the possibility of pain and seizure. The inevitable risk of hurting the ones we love isn't enough to keep us from wanting to reach out, connect with others, show each other how much we care for one another. We keep on loving, we keep sticking together and spending time with each other and being friends, making friends, goofing off, because that love and that friendship is greater than any risk of harm could deter us from seeking it out, again and again and again. And wouldn't it follow that in a story about the harm we cause to the ones we love the most, that inevitability of hurt would rear its head at the story's end one more time? Wouldn't it follow that in that story about how we still love on anyways, that even after finding out about that horrible, tragic end, the characters would decide to stay together and keep loving each other regardless, holding on to their hope and friendship until someone there at the end, be it fate or fate's disruptor, makes that final call? I'd think so.